Thank you all for coming today and welcome to the symposium on the defining of the modern and its decisive interpreter, interlocutor, friend, critic, Richard Bartholomew. This particular symposium has a great appeal for me because it turns the clock back to one of the most foundational aspects of the making of art, and that is art criticism, a deeply neglected discipline as of now. For a critic like myself, who comes, like many others in the line established by Geeta Kapur, this paper carries the potential for an embedded and a historic conversation between Kapur and Bartholomew. It uncovers the period of the blazing energies of modernism, but also the less certain cusp between the great monolith of modernism on one hand and what comes after. The splintered disciplines of post-structuralism, the wave of post-colonial writing, and its many forms, interpretations, and pedagogies. Some of us have come to criticism through the work of Geeta Kapur, particularly her seminal book, Contemporary Indian Artists, and its foundational approach to modernists. So what we have here today is an earlier memory and an interjection of Richard Bartholomew as seen by Geeta. Geeta acknowledges him as a preeminent critic from the 50s to the end of the 70s, a period of 3 decades. Among the panoply of critics of his time, and this was a time when there were several, Richard Bartholomew worked towards what we take for granted as some of the planks of modernism. Geeta's paper on Richard is also an invitation to her own areas of divergence, and the movement of art criticism from being an adjunct of literature to the domain of polemic. Richard Bartholomew subscribed to the school of the imminence of the art critic. This was the criticism of immediacy, or perhaps going into a newspaper office and pounding out a review in the evening so that it could appear in the paper the next morning and becomes a critical way of opinion formation. I may say that those were heady days of the art critics, poorly paid but distinctive power, opinion formation, and the first surge of what to look at when you encounter a work of art. With Geeta's address of Richard Bartholomew, we are obviously on the cusp of change. This is a period of great transition. The 50s, 60s, and the 70s are behind us, and with her entry, certainly the domains of art criticism widen, splinter, and change. The great battles of the 60s lie behind. The entrenched conflicts of art institutions lie behind. And the collusion of the critic with the theorist and the polemicist and the social sciences lie ahead. What her paper will also tease out for us, I imagine, is meaning in art criticism. By meaning, I mean language inspired by literature rather than critical theory or the social sciences, or meaning as culture, as yet untouched by the heart and brazen energies of technology. Most importantly, perhaps, this talk is an opportunity for us who are students of art criticism to draw a line, an arc of continuity, perhaps initiated by O.C. Ganguly, some might say Abanindranath Tagore, and Geeta Kapur, and richly interjected by Richard Bartholomew in the mid-20th century. It's a great pleasure to welcome the other panelists today, Kalidas and Professor Gulammohammed Sheikh, who seem to take up two ends of the spectrum. Sheikh Bhai, as he's very much, as he's popularly known, in the vanguard of another kind of a modernity also inspired by his confreres like Swaminathan and his dialogue with Richard Bartholomew. And those who have the privilege of looking at some of Sheikh Bhai's letters with the earlier modernists see how some of these tendencies were being played out, some of the greatest challenges and the debates of Indian modernity of the 60s and the 70s. And I think this notion of the artist critic, the artist as polemicist, is a foundational aspect of Indian modernity. We have other examples, Swaminathan and of course K.G. Subramanian being very good examples. And Kalidas's presence, I think, brings in another point, but again an arc of continuity, because he is the repository of the Swaminathan archive. He is, as a child, perhaps a witness to many of the great debates of modernism, but he's also got the benefit of hindsight to look back at the debates of the postmodern, the introduction of the post-colonial, and to perhaps posit his point of view of modernism. So thank you for this. With a very brief introduction, I'd like to hand over to Sheikh Bhai. Our structure today is his introduction, followed by Geeta's talk, followed by Kali's response to Geeta, as well as Kali's own response to the papers of Richard Bartholomew. And I should mention here that this is based on the text. This is a massive text, the writings of Richard Bartholomew, drawn from the Richard Bartholomew estate, which Pablo Bartholomew, his son, is now looking to publish. Thank you.
Thinking aloud after days when I first knew of Richard and then knowing him personally. In the late 50s and early 60s, one realizes that we were all in the same boat. We were all in the same boat in the sense that we were all on some kind of a path to explore. For us, as far as my practice is concerned, or in general, it was a sort of a, if I may call it, a moment of the modern that we confronted directly, inherited from our earlier generation. So we were, in fact, beholden to all our peers and our elders. Now, to articulate a moment of that kind, the kind of language that came about, the language that had to be formed, I'm using deliberately the word formed because there was no precedent of that kind. So what kind of critical discourse or art critical discourse would there be? At Baroda, where I studied, in those days, a course in art criticism was introduced. And one of the first students, and one who continued, was LPC Hari. Perhaps the lone example from Baroda, who had studied art criticism and then continued in some manner. Whereas in the case of others, when we think of people like Richard or others, it looked as if they had to develop it themselves. So it was in some way a kind of a self-taught. Now it can't be just from nowhere, it had to have some basis. One of the things which strikes me, there are two aspects which strike me with regard to Richard is, one is that he was so deeply immersed in the world of art, that he was a kind of a personal friend of artists, in the sense of being part of, so almost like a daily practice, that many artists, my seniors would tell me that Richard would come and spend hours in the studio. Richard would perhaps be present at every occasion where something had happened, somebody had painted some new work had come about. So in that sense, he was so much an integral part of the scene. It was, I don't know whether the word scene is the right word, but it was the kind of a world that we inhabited in which a passion to be part of it was so integral that you began inventing. And in that sense, what Richard was doing, no matter whether he wrote for newspaper, whether he wrote for a journal or elsewhere, he had to evolve a language, and he did. Well, that is one aspect of it, and perhaps one would think about some other issues, which I will not dwell upon here, but it would be like those who, let us say, came from other disciplines. We had Charles Fabry before that, who wrote senior to Richard, and then the art scene was in fact was literally dominated by somebody like Charles Fabry. That was in the 50s. But I think what Richard gained, and that is the second point that I wish to make, is that since he wrote poetry, and I think there is something about his being involved in writing poetry that seemed to have informed or perhaps given him some way of writing. So I don't know whether it is, we are not talking about poetic language, we are not talking about how poetry, becomes part of your discourse, but in some way, and when I think aloud, I feel that you had Nissim Mizakil in Bombay, you had Yunis D'Souza in Bombay, you had Deep Patel, also artist, who also wrote. And those all came from Indo-Anglian poetry. An interesting phenomenon. That is one. The second thing which I think one could perhaps bring about is the fact of those who, let us say, arrived on the scene from some other place. What was the planet that we lived in those days? I don't know. But it was something in which we lived as a kind of a family. And I can only use this as a metaphor because we literally knew each and every one. I entered the family as a student. I remember how Hussain introduced me to all the artists in Gulammohammed Memorial Institute, but I also remember that I read what Richard wrote. And in that sense, it was all part of the whole scene. And in that, the dialogue that took place was a kind of an internal dialogue which developed within that. And I do not know, all that we talk about today about being post-colonial is or was in sight. It was something which was seen from within rather than without. We had the vision when we passed perhaps 2 more decades and we began to think in the 70s about the colonial past and the kind of developments that had taken place in the early years of independence. But this was in that sense a period of, so in a way it was growing up. What I'm trying to say is this, that it was growing up with the moment of the modern and trying to articulate that moment of the modern by being inside the scene. And I think this is what made Richard so endearing to many of us. That if ever anybody would get a kind of an opportunity to have Richard writing on your work, one would think that, oh, here is somebody, who would perhaps bring out something. I had an exhibition with him, Geeta Kapur in 62. I remember he wrote my catalog. I used to paint horses and I used to paint those landscapes and things like that. And he went into some kind of a reverie almost parallel to what I was doing. Right or wrong, that's a different thing. But it was that moment in which there was that kind of a bond that existed. And that bond continued for a period of time. And in a way, what I would say is that for some people, some artists like us, I would use a word, here it's a Sanskrit word I'm using, it's a kind of a जो हमारा पिंड होता है ना, वो अंदरूनी कोई जो पिंड जो होता है, जो बनता है, उसके अंदर जो कोई एक चीज अगर डाली जाती है तो वो उससे डाली तो मतलब कि Richard was so much part of that at a later stage there were a number of things which happened and different things happened, but somehow or other when I think of Richard, my mind goes back to 50s and 60s of the time that I first met him. I knew him, and when I interacted with him, and that is something which comes from the only one single point that I want to make, and I would like to hand it over to Kalidas, is I think someday we perhaps have to think about how we evolve not only critical discourse but also the critical language. The kind of critical language that we have evolved now in the last decade or so is something which I find quite fascinating. But I think there were different layers, different levels at which this language evolved. Where Lakshmi Sihare, my and his teacher, Professor Ambedkar, must have asked him to read Penofsky. And that is how he might have perhaps learned his own brand of art criticism. People like me who went to Monroe and read it because we had sort of kind of a inclination towards certain kind of readings into images and then also imagining things. But I was thinking about the way how these dialogues had developed. Suppose if you were to think of the 40s, if you were to think of the 50s and the 60s, and there if you have to place, there are these issues which arise out. One is that there are those who came from, for instance, like Rudy von Leiden, who came from uh, Vienna, settled here. And we had a historian, Dr. Hermann Goetz, who came again from the Germanic background and settled in Baroda and organized the Baroda Museum and wrote a great deal about historical art. But not only historical art, very interestingly, it was for the first time that the exhibition of progressive artists group in Bombay was held in the city of Baroda in the Baroda Museum. So you have something else, you have two discourses, one with the historical art and the other with contemporary. And he, in a way, tried to bring the two together. And somewhere one finds that kind of a situation where the two would meet. And I can imagine, because Richard had interest in Tibetan art, and we know that at one point of time he also became director of the Tibetan Museum, that he also had something within him that could also respond to historical I'm using in a larger sense of the word, and that I think someday if we could do an exercise in which how this, shall I use the word that Richard came from outside? I don't know whether one would say that, but somebody who came from, let's say, of that background, somebody who came from the Viennese background, somebody who came from other backgrounds, and those who came, those who were here, and those who were writing, what background, what kind of background did they have? Was it English literature? Was it poetry? Was it something else? And what kind of a discourse that developed here in our midst? And I think in all these things, when I think of it, there are several names that come to mind. I shall not dwell upon this, but what I would like to say is this, that in this, the name of Richard, or the personality of Richard, or the presence of Richard, that is the word that I would use, makes us all feel so deeply, in some way, intimately close to it.
Thank you, Kiran, Nadar, Rubina, Gayatri for inviting me here, inviting all of us here. I want to preface this by saying that what I'm going to present today is an introduction I've written to a massive volume of Richard's writings, which Pablo has now made ready for printing. It was edited by Richard Bartholomew, Richard's wife, and Carmen Cargill, an editor, many, many years ago. And it is the initiative of Pablo in these past years that a 640-page book is being made ready to be launched in April. And what I'm now presenting is one part of, I have deleted large part, it's a very long essay, is the introduction to that book. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to write this introduction, and I felt some completion of the cycle of my own critical practice by being able to write this in homage and in interrogation of Richard's presence in the Indian art world, so massively felt and yet neglected in the past years. And this opportunity to present it to a much younger audience today, who will at some point look at the book but might take long to actually go through such a massive volume. This is just a possible point of access and entry. I want to thank the Gulam for bringing in the question of poetry and the fact that poets came into art criticism. And I have been privy to a secret which none of us, absolutely I think none of us knew about Richard, and even I have only got glimpse of it. Richard seems to have had a habit from very early on, possibly from college, of taking his Shakespeare books, particularly the Shakespeare tragedies, Macbeth, Lear, and Richard III, and he would scribble on those printed pages annotations which make absolutely no sense. He ringed the figures, he marked the letters A, D off, as well as the more grand metaphors of Shakespeare. He would take an arrow out into the margin and he would number them. And one tried to see what that numbering could mean, and it's impossible to decode. I don't think Rati's been able to tell us how to decode it. Pablo doesn't know, and that's why I do call it precisely what should be both the vocation and the aspiration of an art poet critic. It is the bard's puzzle, and I have no answer to that puzzle. I have deliberately on Pablo's suggestion withheld actually projecting that page, because in a sense that's the surprise of the book. What is this coded page wrapped over a thick volume of Richard's writings? Word ringed and numbered, a monk's scribble, an astronomer's diary, a firmament. What is it we must know about this author? Afresh and again, a scrap from Macbeth, made and unmade in a state of madness, he was never known to possess. He was, in fact, a very gentle and accessible and seemingly rational person. These pages are completely mad. At the moment of 1947, and during the first decade of independence, there was, besides the nation and the republic, and the promises and betrayals of these constitutive institutions, a world to be won in the way only modernity as an international project promised, here and everywhere else. And so this generation was destined, this generation which is immediately at the cusp of the moment of independence, 1947. So this generation was destined to flag their dreams with that emancipatory, even utopic desire. That is important. That is an important word, desire. As we peer at the young faces from the 1950s, they look back with eagerness, innocence, grit, and desire. Maybe because of our own ambiguous mind with a recent yet receding past. Not surprisingly, but of course disappointingly, all the players, not surprisingly, but of course disappointingly, all the players are male. Amrita Shergill would have led the charge, so to speak, but having lived and died before her time, the right time for a declarative stance on modernity, there is no female presence. No female presence at the turn of the 40s when these young male artists appear on the horizon with a modernist credo. Among the galaxy of male protagonists, all of them are in this very famous photograph, there is Akbar Padamsee, Tayyab Mehta and Krishan Khanna. There is V.S. Gaitonde, Mohan Samant and Krishna Reddy. And in Delhi, there is Ram Kumar and Satish Gujral, and there is Birinde, and so on. I'm not counting to the end. Among all of them, I behold Richard Bartholomew. Richard was a Burmese émigré who came to India as a boy in 1942, 1926, and stayed on after the war. He turned into a literary-minded youth at Delhi University, St. Stephen's College, and entered the intellectual life of post-independence Delhi. Richard's photographs of his artist peers are an indelible part of the 1960s imaginary. And self-portraits have an elegance that both courts and shies away and from a narcissism, and which imparts to his visage a vivid and mask-like beauty. Richard, with his compact body and exquisite Burmese features, a face from the page of an Oriental tale, Richard's quixotic presence, his pronounced twitch, his teasing, mocking smile. He might be a Banraku puppet standing beside the tall and landscape. Might be a Bunraku puppet standing beside the tall and landscape, once reticent, later from Maqbul Fida Hussain, his very dear friend from the 1950s, on whom he wrote amongst his best and longest texts, which includes an essay for the international publication on an Indian artist. Richard was a painter, poet, and photographer, but he was known to the public for his vast and declared body of writing on art, produced contemporaneously with the production of the contemporary, now modern, in art. Richard's writing in the 3 decades from the 1950s took birth in artist studios, in traversal of the few exhibition spaces then available and face to face with the then relevant state institutions. It matured on a typewriter in modest dwellings, in the neighborhood of the artist, equally modest studio apartments. Perhaps he is best referred to as an art writer, more so as he favored an immanent form of criticism, a lava-like flow of interpretation, melding the plastic arts with the rhetoric poetics of literature proper. I had not intended to read out a career graph, but it seems that it's been handed back to me. I had suggested Rubina or Gayatri to read it. So I think for the sake of those who don't know Richard Bartholomew as well as we do, it's necessary to very quickly give you the bare background. As I said, he emigrated to India in 1942, stayed on here. He went to Delhi University's St. Stephen's College, and then he taught English at the Modern School between 1951 and 1958. In which time, during this period, he married, in the early 50s, he married Rati Batra, who taught English literature at the Indraprastha College until her retirement. And they had their first son, Pablo, while they were still teaching at the Modern School. I, of course, am the daughter of the principal of Modern School. And the time that Richard was teaching English at the Modern School, I was his student. So I've known Richard much before all of you. I was 10 years old. And he taught us English, he taught us poetry, and he also edited the school magazine, of which I was one of the editors. So I have a special memory and claim of Richard and Rati and their little brat, who's sitting in this photograph called Pablo Bartholomew. From 1951 to 58, he taught at the Modern School. From 1955, he started writing and publishing as an art critic. He wrote for the magazine Thought as well as Indian Express. And then from 1962 onwards, he was a critic of the Times of India through the 70s, or at least till the mid-late 1970s. In between, that is between 60 and 63, he was director Kunika Art Center, later called Kunika Kapur Gallery, and curator then of the first Museum of Tibetan Art at Tibet House in Delhi from 1966 to 1973. In 1971, between 1970 and 71, he was in New York on a fellowship of the famous Rockefeller Fund Fellowship, which had been given to many of our first generation modernists. He curated some important shows of Indian art, among them an official ICC art exhibition celebrating 25 years of Indian independence that traveled to the USA in 73. He restructured an edition of the National Exhibition, also in 1973, which was one of the more pioneering acts of curation, which was not called curation at that time. And I would say that perhaps Krishan Khanna's curation of the first Indian section in the first Trinale in '68 and Richard's 1973 exhibition stand as emblematic of the early acts of curation. He was also a co-curator of the Festival of India exhibition titled Contemporary Indian Art at the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1982, of which I and Akbar Padamsee were co-curators. And from 1977 until his death in 1985, he was Secretary Lalit Kala Academy. Through these 3 decades from the mid-50s, he was the preeminent critic in Delhi and indeed on the national art scene. Besides newspapers and magazines, he wrote many catalogues, introductions to artists' monographic exhibitions, and his articles were published in journals like the Lalit Kala Contemporary, and with a few of his longer texts going into monographs and anthologies. While in the normal course of his writing, Richard foregrounded the uniqueness of affect and ignored the context, his wish to nurture an art community, to cultivate a worthy art scene was fervent. Onwards from 1955, he waged battles against the orthodoxies of the new institutions of independent India, particularly the Lalit Kala Academy, established in 1954, which was seeming to set or possibly rather betray aesthetic standards through its then high-profile national exhibition. In what gleaming battle gear we see Richard arguing his case for what he knew to be good and bold and new art in India in the hands of the young moderns. For example, he immediately flagged Hussein's Zameen, which is projected here in a detail, as the seminal painting of the first decades of Indian independence, even as he valorized Satish Gujral's dramatic self-positioning as a painter of modern India, a portrait of Nehru by Gujral in the 50s. Occasionally, one finds him setting even grander criteria, a portrait, multiple portrait by Hussein, done somewhat later in the early 60s. But I mention these because I want to position Richard not just as a dreamy poet who starts writing on art, but who positions himself in relationship to the institutional structure that had just been put in place in the mid-50s, which is when he starts writing. And I was completely enthralled and amazed to read with what fervor he argues for the establishment of the modern as a sensibility and as an aesthetic, almost as an ethic within the institutional structure of then contemporary Indian art. Occasionally, one finds him setting even grander criteria and placing art in connection with the nation and the state, and certainly with society and the public, enjoining artists to fulfill the social contract as citizens of the new republic. This too was a complete surprise, and I have quoted these quite extensively in this introduction, and it will lead you as readers to those texts in the larger book. At the time that he joined the Academy as secretary in 1977, the institution still attracted enlightened state intervention and artists' participation, such as the sophisticated cluster of artists including Swaminathan and Krishan Khanna at work on the 1978 Trinale of India, of which Richard was very much a part. And it provided a platform for polemical takes on the future of art and future of art as an institution. Richard served the Academy for nearly 8 years, and then just before he was to retire, he very suddenly died. He slipped into a coma one day in January 1985, and after a few days in hospital, he passed on. It is a strange coincidence that decades later, I wrote this introduction in the cold days of January, as if in lieu of an obituary I never wrote at that time. If it is so, then it is good and right, because as the not to be forgotten RLB, as he often used to sign himself, So often, as RLB so often like to quote the T.S. Eliot line, "In my beginning is my end." I'm looping back to the time of Richard, and I refresh my beginnings and possibly sharpen the contours of a purposeful end. Richard was, of course, as Ghulam also pointed out, one amongst several other critics who were already operating within what was the developing contemporary art scene. And it is interesting, for example, to remember that the very important book which W.G. Archer brought out in 1959, after he'd returned to England and after he had in fact devoted himself to a totally different field, or not totally different, a distinctly different field of particularly folk and tribal art, but also larger than the larger frame of the Indian tradition. That this book that came out in 1959, Archer argued why Amrita Shergill, Rabindranath Tagore, Jamini Roy and George Keith should be regarded the first moderns. Richard had a pretty much similar list for the time. Only George Keith was substituted by a favorite of Delhi artist, Silas Mukherjee, who's in a sense all but lost to our imagination, has not in fact been, except that he's considered one of the national treasures by the government of India, has not been celebrated. I owe some of these, I want to acknowledge here that I owe some of the framing of what I'm going to say, or what I have written at any rate, I may not say it in detail here, to Vidya Shivdas, who did a wonderful short essay, but a very pointed essay, contextualizing the critical scene from W.G. Archer, Mulk Rajanan, through Swaminathan, to me, and then to Rajit Hoskote. A text very worth reading. It is on the net, the Asian Art Archive online website. In Bombay, there was the redoubtable Mulk Raj Anand, acclaimed writer and close friend and comrade of the Bombay progressives. And he gave them a prominent place in the pages of his radical arts magazine, Marg, which was started in 1946. And I particularly chose this image of Mulk because that's how I knew him. And he would sit there with his very, very khaki shorts and have his coffee and read and expound. And if he was not in his shorts, he was in an attire which he attributed to his having participated in the Spanish Civil War. And so Mulk's internationalism was extraordinary and dazzling for most of us. Those of us who knew him in the 1960s couldn't believe that we were in the presence of such an extraordinary internationalist who'd shared a room with Dylan Thomas and who'd been on the BBC with George Orwell and T.S. Eliot and whatnot. Endorsing Nehruvian terms, Mulk Rajanand endorsing Nehruvian terms for a national modern culture. He was also a forsworn internationalist and galvanized a large debate around Third World modernity in the 1960s. When he became chairman of the Lalit Kala Academy in 1965, there was an upswing, and the Academy organized several polemically posed seminars, not to speak of an international event of the scale of the Triennale India begun in 1968. Artistic ambitions and public controversies peaked during the 1960s, and Delhi became the hub where art practice swerved around in an improvised choreography, civic and state engagement, bohemian attitudinizing, and anarchist stances. The axis of contemporary art was decidedly Bombay and then Delhi. So let me step back and recall another key spokesperson on Bombay's critical scene, who Ghulam has already mentioned, Rudi von Leiden. From the 1930s, Bombay had become one of the places of refuge for Jewish German immigration, and Rudi was one amongst 3 or 4 major figures who featured in the history of modern Indian art. I shall not speak about this in detail. I have written about it at some length here. It is interesting that Rudy wrote primarily for the Times of India in Bombay, just as Richard wrote for the Times of India in Delhi. And a useful comparison can be drawn between the older Rudy and the younger Richard, especially as both had a lively and provocative style of writing that was artist-friendly, bold, and actually instructive. Rudy, steeped in European modernism, provided an art historical account that the then Indian moderns assimilated into their practice with quick intelligence. Richard was inclined to annotate the contemporary with a poetics derived more generally from the modern ethos. I might just point out for those who don't know, writings which are were compiled by him in a scrapbook belong to the Baroda Art Archive in the Art History Department, and which was given personally by him, leather-bound scrapbook of his writings, and in large part they are reproduced by Yashodhara Dalmia in her book on the Bombay Progressives called The Moderns. Among Richard's co-critics in Delhi was Charles Fabry, an Hungarian who had moved from Lahore to Delhi after the partition and made India his home. There was Jaya Appaswamy, who had studied at Shantiniketan, gone to Oberlin College in the USA, and taken her MA in art history, and ran the journal Lalit Kala Contemporary from 64 to 1976. Others on the scene from the 60s into the 90s were the poet critic Keshav Malik, the Marxist critic Shanto Datta, and there was the intrepid, he is a forgotten figure in Delhi, the intrepid K.B. Goel, who wrote for the leftist papers Patriot and Link. One could say a great deal more about this context, but that there is no time and place for this. But this is to suggest that there was indeed very active review criticism in the 60s and 70s in India, and it is impossible to actually communicate to our younger artists and critics what importance that review criticism had in the making of both a language of criticism and the language of art. If I might pay my little postscript tribute to Gayatri, she continued this tradition in the Hindu for the longest time until even the Hindu found it unnecessary to inscribe its otherwise very enlightened view with an art critical discourse. Besides the operating critics, there were artist writers who commanded unique authority and authority and a good deal of awe. There were, as Gulam mentioned, Nissim Ezekiel and Dev Patel and Eunice D'Souza in Bombay, all poets. In Delhi and in Baroda, and the influence of these two figures was enormous, it was nationwide. I refer to the two overlapping figures of K.G. Subramaniam in Baroda and J. Swaminathan in Delhi, who wrote extensively. I will not speak about Richard's relationship to Subramaniam because it is not so particularly vivid or significant, but I will speak about Richard's relationship to Swaminathan, and all the more so because Kalidas is sitting here and he is going to chronicle that period through the archive of Swaminathan, and the relationship of Swaminathan and Richard was legend. Swaminathan, starting his career as an activist demagogue in the Communist Party of India, became a journalist, then art critic, then artist, and indeed for a period played several of these roles simultaneously. The entry and career in the art world of Swaminathan and Richard overlapped in terms of dates, 1955 approximately, and in that each was artist, critic, critic, artist. Swami more and more the artist, Richard more and more the critic. Tellingly, each wrote for a magazine exactly antithetical to the other in the matter of ideology. Richard for the anti-left thought, Swami for the CPI mandated link. Like a camouflaged commissar, Swaminathan could rule the art world in which Richard functioned, even use political clout to threaten to block the critic's adversarial voice. Kalidas claims that he never actually did that. Richard retaliated, and the artist and critic staged stereotypical yet spirited battles, high voltage repartees, a show of guts, and even a bit of gore. Even those of us who witnessed the sophisticated polemic between Richard and Swami, their cut and thrust of words, would find it hard to say who won. If you see Richard's gentle face and this fierce visage you have on the screen, you'd assume that Swami won. I'm not very sure. Richard had absolutely at his best when he parried with Swaminathan. And I say this in the context where when we today for us today it is hard to know where the stakes are placed in our over-convivial art world. An art world replete with neoliberal exchange and relational maneuvers. I now take this story into my own domain because I had already started writing fledgling criticism in the 60s between my stint in New York as a student and in London. But in the 1970s, I did appear on the scene. And I bring myself in both seriously and with a degree of narcissism and cheek. It was my turn in the 1970s to show the hubris of youth. Considering that I'm in a wheelchair and lame, I thought I will insert this for a little bit of restoration of self-esteem. I was, and I no doubt appeared and behaved as this radically made-over new woman critic on the block. Today, as I hold the manuscript of Richard's writings and read page by page the wizardry of his words, I feel both a debt of gratitude and an embarrassment at having known him from when I was so young, and yet known him and regarded him with the due respect not well enough. But let me begin the story right. I have already mentioned that I met him, I knew him when I was 10 years old. He lived in the same campus where I, with my family, my father lived, and I knew him continuously from then onwards, when I would have seen him in 1955 as a senior student through all the years that he was changing his profile, as it were, from a young critic to a preeminent figure. It is, however, what I would like to insert here is that it could possibly be because of Richard that writing on art appeared to me from my teens to be a legitimate and ardent pursuit. I can't be sure of this, I'm saying this retroactively. There was two figures in my school days, Kanwal Krishna and Richard Bartholomew, and the art school at the modern school was like an atelier, a hub for artist meetings, which included Satish Gujral, Ram Kumar, Dhanraj Bhagat, and a host of others, so that school art room was like the kind of the equivalent of Delhi Shilpi Chakra. There was much regaling and drinking in the school art room, which was literally next door to our house and my father's presence. In the early 1960s, I went to New York University for post-graduation in art criticism and art history, and there I learned something of that American boldness to declare and extrapolate as a critic. A little later, I went to the Royal College of Art in London, where I completed another postgraduate course conducted by a Marxist artist teacher, Peter de Francia. Here I learned to polemicize and better to dialectically theorize. With these two apprenticeships, the nomenclature of critic started to spell complexity. I just might mention that all these photographs are from the 1960s. This is in New York. This above is New Delhi and a photograph taken by Gulammohammed Sheikh. And the one below is also from the mid-1960s, which is precisely at the point at which I began to write on art. While belonging among artists and working closely with art-making processes, I decided to bypass review criticism and pressed on to write a book quite early in my career. This was the book came out in 1978, and it covered the artists, very many of the artists, or a large number of the artists that Richard favored, and included Swaminathan and Bhupen, who are technically of the second generation, although in age they are not so different from the progressives and the colleagues of the progressives who were included in my first book. Just as much as Richard had held in close regard the artist's intention, I prodded the primal act and the artist's intention, and further meddled with the image and iconography produced by the artist's sanctified hand. As much as Richard opposed autonomous and motivated acts of intellectual hubris that criticality upholds, I favored just that, wanting to engage simultaneously with Marxist agendas, post-colonial antagonisms, and existential paradoxes. The word discourse was more or less absent from art vocabulary at the time and was never used by Richard. So sans discourse, what we have is Richard's corpus of writing, his bristling oeuvre, and the confirmed fact that he provided the key commentary for the first few acts in the unfolding drama of Indian modernism. The very theme that I claim to have taken over into another, perhaps more determinedly problematized phase. I might add that my strain of art criticism was so antithetical to Richard that it met with sardonic silence from him. What Richard did was to nurture the field of contemporary art using metaphors and allegories from his love of literature, from the fact that he was a poet as well, metaphors and allegories of life, death, and beauty. And though we might quibble a little with the poetry, he did literally forge a language on the anvil in the smithy of the soul, as James Joyce would say in his famous novel, The Artist as a Young Man. First, there was his reliance on the discrete quality of the modernist aesthetic, termed rather old-fashionedly for that time significant form, which later in mid-century American criticism turned into a much harder proposition with formal grit. It lent accuracy to the way perception and description, interpretation and evaluation were together pitched. Second, he constructed a critical frame to accommodate art historical and cultural references, though rather than any presumed privilege of the critic or the artist, the sovereignty of the artist was constantly upheld. They met, artist and critic, as co-travelers in a keenly lived life of human desire and the aesthetics thereof. Third, there was some pedagogy in the way Richard adopted a survey approach in many of his longer articles published in Thought and later in the Lalit Kala Academy Contemporary. The critic, he seemed to say, must conscientiously lay the ground over and over again, with the hope and even perhaps the injunction that the modern Indian artist ground himself and find some evolutionary logic to his practice. This should count as a gift of sustenance from the critic to the artist in a situation that was still at that time impoverished in terms of recognition, patronage, market, and livelihood. Finally, this mass of writing conveys Richard's sense of responsibility in that he wanted to bring an art community into existence. Consider his careful annotation of works for the lay viewer, as also his regard for the advanced reader. Think of what this generous, opinionated, ambiguous offering of words will have done for them, for the viewers and the readers, provided them an occasion to understand and appreciate why artworks exist, where they come from, and how they come alive if you are helped to cross the demanding threshold of art. And Richard, who seemed to be so light-handed in the way he spoke and wrote, in actual fact, fulfilled this function. His die-hard modernism is interestingly notated by, in one of the articles in the late 1950s, where he very emphatically names 4 artists who he considers to be the reigning modernists of the time. He names Hussain, Ram Kumar, Satish Gujral, and Mohan Samant. And this is an interesting list because if you know the languages exercised by these artists, you will see that he had actually encompassed quite a large range of sensibility as well as ambitions which were to unfold later in different ways with these artists. Hussain was ever present in his writing as a generous, humane, inclusive yet shape-shifting figure, and he spoke vividly of Hussein's appearance, his personality, his persona, his life, his dual and multiple cultures, as also of Hussein's spare and elegant words. He spoke of Hussein's paintings in the way the Romantics coined the word imago. And I quote just a few lines. When we are away from Hussain painting, we try to comprehend its connotation. Face to face with it, we not only see it, we see it happen before our eyes. Something happens in us, in our eyes, and a voice which is neither Hussein's nor ours begins to speak. Not to us, but in us. Perhaps it is the voice of the painting. There is a revelation then, and we are the richer for having come upon an intuition. Only art of a considerable quality can offer this. Along with Hussain, it was on Ram Kumar that Richard wrote the maximum number of texts. This identification was tinged by a very early university friendship and the shared existentialism of that period among artists and writers, and of Ram Kumar as a fiction writer as well. Richard's writing on Ram Kumar possessed a very tender tenor, and here you have Richard, Ram Kumar, and Rati, Richard's wife, out on a holiday together, which they regularly took to the mountains. There is a star of sorrow. This is a quotation. There is a star of sorrow that seems to shine above these characters, Ram's characters, Ram Kumar's painting's characters. There is a star of sorrow that seems to shine above these characters in search of an author. And the city and its body odor, its trapbox mazes, and its neutral decor form a memory of torment for the flight-stricken characters. We know they are in fact on the threshold of self-discovery. Via Ram Kumar, Richard was dedicated to creating a universe of thought that was austere and sublime, a universe that was Shakespeare and ending with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a poem that Ram Kumar quoted in the title of a seminal painting in 1961, which is here on the screen, wherein he achieved a form of elegy that fulfilled a compact of word and image as also a compact between the two lifelong friends. I tried to persuade Ram to come. I don't know if he has come. I really regret if he hasn't. Richard throughout wrote on art in relation to the human condition as also of oppression and despair. This was, after all, an integral part of the expressionist principle that he had always prioritized. In the 1970s, faced with different types of representational modalities, he supplemented his existentialist inclination with a certain form of painterly gravitas marked by more social calling. As in his article Attitudes to the Social Condition, Notes on Ram Kumar, Satish Gujral, Krishan Khanna, and A. Ramachandran, he might still invoke the earlier expressionism of Ram Kumar and Gujral, but he now included the new form of social figuration. The melodramatic Mexican-inspired mural size paintings of Ramachandran and the paintings of Krishan Khanna. He believed that both artists brought new blood to the expressionist principle, and if the message came closer to the more realist substratum of expressionist modernism, he accepted that because these artists aspired to the epic and thus enhanced the horizon of human consciousness. This is a wonderful picture that a photograph Richard has taken of Christian painting, one of his most seminal paintings, The Death of Che. And you have the iconic poster of Che next to Krishan while he paints in his lungi, the monochromatic painting of the Death of Che, very closely based on, in a sense, in its allegorical mode, to a text written by John Berger on the death pictures of Che that the American imperialists advertised at the time of their capture and murder of Che Guevara. One artist from this generation most conspicuously problematized was Francis Newton Sousa. Here was an expressionist beyond redemption. Yes, I just wanted to show this. Here is Krishan in painting in his home, in his small studio in his home, and here he is in his drawing room, surrounded by, in the center is Ram Kumar, to the right is Kumar of Kumar Gallery, and in the center is Krishan's own painting, and this is truly a suave and sophisticated and internationalist image that you can get of modern Indian art in the late 60s. One artist of this generation that Richard most conspicuously problematized was Newt Sousa. He was an expressionist beyond redemption, perhaps, or shall we say a human being, an artist and writer, for Sousa famously wrote as forcefully as he painted, beyond redemption, whose courage and skill Richard might admire, but whose desire to shock he abhorred. If Richard dodged Sousa's genius, Sousa was too hard-bitten for Richard, or perhaps Richard was had too civilized a stake on art. He did on occasion joust with him as with the devil, and brought forth in a hellish flash his own vitriolic brilliance that matched Sousa's. I have a quotation of a description of Sousa's crucifixion, but because that painting is not this one, I will not read that description, but I would urge all those who will then pick up this book of Richard's writings to read Richard's writing on Sousa with both horror and awe. And he writes particularly on the way he treats the female figure, and the Kiran Nadar Museum has some of the most extraordinary nudes of Sousa, which could create in Richard at that time, and then in Anupam Sood, who's taken a picture of her, a photograph sitting in front of those nudes and challenging the misogyny of Sousa. This has been a matter of conflict and debate, admiration and awe, and disgust and horror for decades. And Richard was part of that mixed, ambiguous relationship to Sousa. There is now a turn in the 1970s in Richard's writing to alternative set of choices. He approved every turn towards abstraction that the figurative artists of his generation undertook in the early 1960s. He paid close attention to the elements, the formal elements in the painting, in Ramkumar, in Raza, in Gaitonde, and I put here both Sousa and Gaitonde, the devil and the monk, as it were, and he could straddle addressing the work of both of them with enormous skill and sensitivity. He wrote about Krishna Reddy and Kanwal Krishna, his long-standing friend from the days in modern school, and Krishna Reddy, on whom he wrote beautifully, and in both cases, being graphic artists, he spoke about the kind of illumination that they're able to bring through the use of the graphic element, through the use of in the way they treat the plate, the etching plate, and the way they are able to produce through well stereotyped or innovative as they might be, technical skills, a certain kind of luminosity. And he spoke at length about his very dear old friend Birende. And here is Birende with his well-known stance with the pipe. And Richard and Biren were friends right from the early 50s. And he wrote very well on Biren. It is worth reading, whatever one's own retroactive evaluation of Birende's work. It is worth reading Richard on Birende. At its purest, he wrote about Birende, and I just quote a line. Richard, and this is the end, poetics, the poetics of Richard in sum. Richard shared with his generation of artists the need to secure the universal, experienced phenomenologically and in such terms that are by the convention attributed to the subject position of the artist. And the two artists that were, in a sense, on the cusp of the modernist generation and the generation of Place for People are indeed Jairam and Nasreen, who don't belong in either configuration, in either constellation, and who were, of course, very close friends. If the model has the artist, if the model is the artist, then Richard was certainly the twin who elaborated the discipline through poetics that has an ambiguous but persistent sense of the symbolic, and of that which the reader, of that which renders the self to a hypostasis of the soul. This moved in quick and affirmative metaphysic derived from the self predicated as above. When you see the mass of Richard's writings compiled in this book, you witness how the man and the critic willed his word self and honed his writerly skill to translate the artist's death drive back to human striving. Perhaps that is why he supported not Sousa's diabolic expose, but Hussein's mythic sense, Ramkumar's elegy to survivors, Gujral's struggle with what he called the mortal coil. And if and when he digressed from the high ground of humanity, it was in the wake of some unearthly light trapped within a form of esoteric symbology. But I want to approach the end of this exposition on a different note. As part artist, we can see Richard indulge in the pleasure of the paint, beheld the many-hued light, braved the dark night of the soul, and touched the wound. And here in the quick of that moment, when he prods the wound, I see him recoil. I see him digress from a sanguine state of the human. I see him on the track of the lone wolf, the name he gave his friend Jairam Patel. There is Jairam in Richard's home, and there is Pablo and Robin admiring him intensely for the smoke rings that he Jairam Patel, whose square jaw and broad forehead, the hard eyes and steady stare and heavy mop of hair form a head which is considerably taller than most in this country. A man of exceedingly few words or of fewer friendships, he is a lone wolf. And sometimes we hear the howl of this creature in the work, in the silence of the scene. What is Jairam's idiom, he asks? What is the idea that generates itself in the action involved in the making and in the existence of the thing in itself consequent to its having been made? What is it that he discovers for us in this pursuit, which is surgical on the one hand and plastic on the other? And why is it that a graft that has been established has to be cauterized sometimes? End of quote. And I quite like the idea of leaving him there, leaving Richard there, on that swerving track where he expressed something of a secret self and a form of affection in extremis. Here we have the absolute logic of absolute angst placed precisely within one of the ruling tropes of modernity, that an artist's creative epiphanies can only be realized in the art of destruction. And this is Jairam doing his act of destruction in order to create his work. But I must conclude, I suppose, on a more calibrated note. Richard repeatedly invoked the acts of creation, perception, reception, and judgment, all conducted in a state of integrity and equanimity. To integrity and equanimity, we must add irony, because that caveat or truth shaped Richard's precise style of expression. This irony reflected a state of detachment towards the world's paradoxes, yet wore the compulsion of being there. Within this broad framework, he was committed to suture the recurring states of rupture that modernity brings. This is a photograph taken by Pablo of his parents in possibly the late 70s, early 80s, maybe later. I'm sorry, I don't remember the date. But no, I must still end differently. For when all is said, Richard the humanist was dedicated to a desired plenitude in terms of which our comic tragic life is mapped and which shapes the course of our becoming in the way Shakespeare, his beloved mentor, might have taught him. With the irony, he signaled a wryly intoned melancholy. And I refer again to the mysterious game Richard seems to have played with the printed pages of Shakespeare's tragedies, Macbeth, Richard III, King Lear, where with all the refinement of the mildly mad fool, he was testing some terminal secret through his own écriture and inventing arbitrarily a cosmos to locate the bard's puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. That was elegiac and magisterial, and the locating of the human at the core of human imagination quite brilliantly done. We looked at the endings, the three endings, which suggest the movement from the domains of camaraderie and shared friendship to possibly the lonely corner of the critic and the tragic impulse, even in the very heroic pursuit of his own work. And I think this is an interesting point to perhaps lay further and lay open the provocations that have been placed in the paper and give this to Kalidas.
Ghalib said of Bedil, the Persian poet on whom Ghalib looked towards Bedil as a mentor. And Ghalib says, Tarz-e Bedil rekhta mein kehna Asadullah ka qayamat hai. And I am in a similar position. Ghalib says that to try and imitate the song of Bedil in Urdu is for calling for doomsday. You know, and after Geeta's so wonderful introduction to Richard's book, mine is perhaps an inadequate and a redundant footnote, but let me get on with it. I must begin by thanking the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art and Gayatri Sinha for inviting me to be a part of such an august panel as the one here today. Gulammohammed Sheikh and Geeta have already spoken so eloquently and with such incisive retrospection that I feel like the child in Apu in Ray's Pather Ponchali, whose silent gaze follows the narrative of the film. That I feel like the child Apu in Ray's film Pather Ponchali, whose silent gaze follows the narrative of the film. Interestingly, the film was made a year before I was born. It was made in 1955, perhaps the year Pablo was born, and is set in 1929, a year after my father J. Swaminathan's birth. Swaminathan was born in Simla, the summer capital of the British Raj, in 1928. Richard was born 2 years earlier, in 1926, in Rangoon, in what was then British Burma. Though both belong to colonial urban families, Richard Lawrence Bartholomew and Jagdish Swaminathan were in many senses antonyms of each other. I tend to see their lives entwined like two serpents around the Caduceus, the staff of Hermes, one cancelling the potency of the other's poison, if you will. Let us reacquaint ourselves with the symbol of Caduceus, In Greek mythology, Hermes was the herald or the messenger of the gods to humans. He was a patron of boundaries and travelers who crossed them. He was the protector of shepherds and cowherds, of gamblers, liars, and thieves, of orators and wit, of literature and poets, of athletics and sports, of weights and measurements, of invention and of commerce in general. The staff of Hermes, which is called the Caduceus in Latin, derives from the Roman iconography where it is being depicted as being carried in the left hand of Mercury. Mercury, of course, being the Roman equivalent of the Greek Hermes. It is denoted by the symbol of a short staff entwined by two serpents. It is sometimes surmounted with wings. By extension of its association with Hermes and Mercury, this staff is also the recognized symbol of commerce and negotiation, two realms in which balance, exchange, and reciprocity are recognized as ideals. This association is ancient and consistent from the classical period to modern times. For example, the caduceus is also used as a symbol representing printing and by extension to the attributes of Mercury, in this case associated with those of writing, eloquence, and even journalism perhaps. So the ever-jostling duel of eloquence and rhetoric between Richard Bartholomew and Jagdish Swaminathan perhaps held the Indian art world both in awe but also in balance, as it were. The two contrasting lives in the colonial capital in ferment. Geeta Kapur invokes the coincidence of the Bombay Progressive Show in 1947 with national independence. I would like to rewind the story a bit further back. Let us begin the story from the year of Richard's arrival in colonial Delhi, 1942. 1942 was a momentous watershed in modern Indian history. World War II was raging and the Imperial Japanese Army had taken Rangoon. The Japanese and Subhash Bose's Azad Hind Fauj were threatening the borders of British India's eastern frontier. In August that year, the Congress Party gave a call for the British to quit India, encouraging students to join the last phase of the independence struggle. Within months in 1943, Bengal was to see a man-made famine during which around 2 to 4 million people died of starvation, malnutrition, disease, and India was on boil. Chitta Prasad, we know, recorded that horrific period in his haunting works. Delhi received the first trickle of displaced people in those years. Many Indians living in Burma and some Burmese nationals, including Richard Bartholomew, arrived from Rangoon. Amongst these refugees was also my granduncle, E. Ganesh Iyer, Swaminathan's mother's elder brother, with his wife and 3 children. They sheltered for some time in my grandfather's government house in Hanuman Road, a house which already had 10 children of his own. That year, 1943, Richard joins the highly Anglicized St. Stephen's College in Kashmiri Gate to study English literature. Swami is admitted to the pre-medical course in the rival Hindu college the same year. But within weeks, Swami sells his bicycle and runs away to Calcutta. While Richard is studying English at St. Stephen's, Swami is selling second-hand books on the payments of a starve in Calcutta. He is picked up by a revolutionary Bengali who introduces a 16-year-old Swami to ideas of revolution and the Congress Socialist Party. For the next 5 years, that is till 1948, when Geeta Kapur first meets Richard in the model school classroom, Swami is a full-time functionary of the Congress Socialist Party, where he is being tutored in Marxism by the likes of Ram Manohar Lohia, Yadatta Narayanan, and Aruna Asaf. In 48, Swami quarrels with Jayaprakash Narayan, the leader of the Congress Socialist Party, meets Gandhiji for the first and last time, and leaves the Congress to join the Communist Party of India as a full-timer. He now lives at the Karol Bagh Party office And fellow traveler Mohit Sen remembers him thus, and I'm now quoting from the memoirs of Mohit Sen. In those days, I got to know J. Swaminathan. He's talking about 53. In those days, I got to know J. Swaminathan, who went on to become one of India's best known painters. He had come from the Communist Party. He had come to the Communist Party from the left socialist group in the Congress led by Yedatatta Narayanan and Aruna Asaf Ali. He was a party whole-timer in the Karolbagh party, and he was in love with a beautiful young student whose parents were more than somewhat skeptical about his ability to take care of her. He also wondered whether he could combine love with old-timership. His hair was then shorter and he was less disheveled, but otherwise he was the same Swami of later years of fame and self-destruction. In those days, he wrote striking poems that were a blend of mysticism and hymns to revolutionary struggle. More striking than his poems was his sparkling wit and talk. There was breadth of knowledge, search for truth, and an assertion of conviction. He was good at argument, and that specially endeared him to me. I am happy that I strengthened his resolve both to marry his love and remain a communist. We continued to meet in Delhi, and I used to read about him every now and then. Then I went to one of his exhibitions and found how much he had changed. The bond that remained was of memory and affection and affinity with a soul in anguish. He obviously remained creative till the end, but the urge to self-destruct became too strong and eventually overwhelmed him. It was tragedy alone. It is a part of tragedy, a sense of individuality, brimming with talent, wanting to find a focus in life through the party, and wanting to express themselves in a unique way. Somehow the party inspires such persons up to a point, but then comes the pressure of conformity, the envy of mediocrity, and the arrogance of those who equate political proficiency with the capacity to pass judgment on everything. That was the marked feature of the Stalinist ethos of the Communist Party leadership at that time. I quoted that in some length because I propose to link that urge to self-destruct, as Sen calls it, within the lives of both Richard and Swami. Sen attributes the pressure of conformity, the envy and arrogance of mediocrity within the party structure in the case of Swami. But that was not the lone factor. In any case, Swami had left the party by the time he started treating that role. Genes might have something to do with it too. Swami's favorite uncle, Ganesh Iyer, who had come from Rangoon, was given to heavy drinking, as were Swami and Richard. Heavy drinking and bohemian lifestyle were quite the order for men and women in the arts in those days. With Van Gogh and Silos Mukherjee, whom Geeta mentioned earlier, on whom there is a very moving essay in this collection, as his painterly idols, Swami cultivated a persona that was part witch doctor and part anarchist. Richard, as Geeta remarks, was the introverted poet as a young man. The twain was ever to do. Their dwelling on matters of art apart, they shared a similar existence in the same small circle that made art life in post-partition Delhi. Around the mid-50s, Swami joined the evening classes at Delhi Polytechnic. Both began writing on art by day and painting privately by night initially. Later, when Swami became a full-time painter from 1967 onwards, Richard flowered as the first serious critic on the Indian art scene. Their roles became increasingly adversarial, but they continued to meet regularly for several times a week, because they had no options. They shared too many common friends to be at daggers drawn all the time. Richard's most admired painter, Ram Kumar, was known to Swami from his childhood. They both went to the same school, and Ram's younger brother Nirmal Verma, the Hindi novelist and essayist, was Swami's closest lifelong friend. Richard admired Hussain Saab and wrote extensively on him. Hussain also had a close relationship with Swami. It was Hussain who introduced Ghulam Sheikh to Swami in 61. and they were soon to form the group 1890 that marked an important landmark in Indian modernism's episodic narrative. Richard befriended and praised the work of several group 1890 painters, Geeta has already mentioned this, like Jairam Patel, Himmat Shah and Amar Das, but tore into Swami for the polemic of the manifesto published on the occasion of their only exhibition in 1963, even if it was 10 years later after the event. There were older artists like Krishan Khanna, Dhanraj Bhagat, Pradosh Das Gupta and Bhavesh Sanyal, all of whom bestowed equal affection and patronage on both Richard and Swami, but always individually. Both shared a love of poetry, but their tastes differed widely. Richard quoted Shakespeare and Eliot, and in his writing, Richard quotes Shakespeare and Eliot in his writings and wrote poetry in English himself. Swami spouted Thomas Gray, Coleridge, and Blake. But more than English poets, Swami quoted people like Mir, Ghalib, Jigar, Kabir, and many modern Hindi and Urdu poets who were his close friends. Swami, of course, wrote his verses in Hindi. Sadly, not unlike the party in Swami's early life, the Lalit Kala Academy became Richard's nemesis in his later life. Richard's earliest writings, in fact, his first piece of writing perhaps published in this collection, in this compilation, are on the politics of the Lalit Kala Academy and the role of the nascent Indian state in the development of the art in the country. It was tragic that he was to so knowingly fall a prey to the insidious machinations and petty politics that ruled and still continue to rule these state institutions. In the end, I would like to congratulate Pablo Bartholomew, his mother Rati, and friend Carmen Kagal, who have put together this fascinating and panoramic compilation of Richard's writings. But even this is not a complete opus of Richard Bartholomew's works. A biography needs to be done. Archiving is a serious and important precursor to history writing, and when the history of Indian art in Delhi is being written, the archives of several important artists, beginning with the likes of Bhavesh Sanyal, Pradosh Das Gupta, Shanko Chaudhary, Satish Gujral, and Rajesh Mehra, to name only a few, are bound to throw more interesting light and open new avenues of debate and discourse.